It was a weekend of protests across the country, including here in Boston, with renewed calls for widespread police reform after the Memphis Police Department released the footage of several of its officers brutally beating Tyre Nichols, who died from his injuries a few days later.
Say his name! Say his name! Justice for Tyre Nichols!
In the week since his death on January 10th, 5 Memphis officers were fired by the department, and last week they were all charged with second-degree murder. The city has also disbanded the so-called Scorpion Unit that they were a part of, which was created to target high-crime areas. And today, a 6th officer has been placed on leave in connection with Nichols' death. Now, activists, protesters, and the head of the Tennessee chapter of the NAACP are calling for national reforms to prevent police brutality like this from happening in the first place.
We come to call to action for Congress. By failing to craft and pass bills to stop police brutality, you are writing another black man's obituary. The blood of Black America is on your hand, so stand up and do something.
Joining me to discuss the status of police reform in this country are Professor Jody David Armour, a law professor at the University of Southern California, who studies the intersection of race and legal decision-making, and Rahsaan Hall, former director for the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU of Massachusetts, the 2022 Democratic nominee for Plymouth County District Attorney, and now the founder and principal of Rahsaan Hall Consulting. Welcome to both of you. Rahsaan, I want to start with you first. I had a conversation today with some law enforcement people in the area in Massachusetts, asking to kind of confirm my opinion of watching that terrible tape of the murder over the weekend. And to me, it violated a number of basic police protocols, one of which would be to call for a supervisor and to slow things down when something like that is getting out of hand. Yet here we are discussing how we can have nationwide federal reforms when on such a basic level so many violations occurred that resulted in this murder. What's your take on what has to happen here?
Well, part of the problem with the conversation about reform is that there have been reforms. There was recent reform in 2020 in Memphis that required de-escalation and intervention, and we still find an incident like this. And so the real root of the problem is the nature of policing itself. Yes, you can have as much training as you want, but until the ideologies that informed how policing happens, particularly how race filters into it, we're going to continue to see these types of incidents occurring throughout the country. And I think that's why there have been calls for defunding the police. That's why there has been a movement towards abolition, because people believe that with this type of policing, we never get to the underlying causes and root causes or underlying issues that require people to call the police in the first place.
Professor Armour, as a woman and as a lesbian, and as someone who has fought for representation at tables, to be in the room when things are happening, to help to decrease misogyny, decrease homophobia, I'm also distinctly aware that just being there is not necessarily going to change those things overnight, and sometimes the reverse happens. And the challenge here as well for some watching this and not paying much attention, the officers that have been charged were black, the victim was black. Just having representation is not going to bring police reform, correct?
Yeah, this really shines a light on the poverty and hollowness of the purely representational approach to social and racial justice, right? Because what we've seen is that when people put on that blue uniform, that identity seems to drown out all the other identities that they came to that blue uniform with, and its underlying logic takes hold. And so, yes, you know, it seems anomalous to some that we could call it racism if it's perpetrated by black officers. How can that be anti-black bias? It can be on a couple levels. Number one, black people have a lot of anti-black bias too toward other black folk. That is established in studies, unconscious bias, you know, good and bad hair, a lot of ways that there can be anti-Black bias within Black folk. And then number two, of course, is systemic bias, right? If you locate police in certain neighborhoods, you tell them they can make pretextual stops that really kind of violate the Fourth Amendment. It says, I don't have a probable cause to pull you over. All I have is a hunch. But if I find a crack on your tail light, that can be a pretext for pulling you over, and I can practice stop and frisk on wheels, right? Those kind of systemic factors are also part of what make it kind of structural racism, because you don't see that happening in Beverly Hills. You see it happening in South Central, where I'm living.
Rahsaan, we talk about the concept of defunding or changing the budgeting process or bringing in social workers to respond to mental health calls. There's a number of efforts that have been put forward to try and reduce police violence against citizens, against their bosses, if you will. Yet we still, as you point out, and we see issues like this continue to happen. We're not going to abolish the police or defund the police anytime soon. So what are steps that people should be calling for, both on the local level and on the federal level, to try and have a police force that is more guardian than warrior?
Yeah, I think it begins with really addressing some of the underlying issues, making sure that there is funding. The reason that this unit exists is to interact with high crime areas, so-called high crime areas, or engage with people who are engaged in gang violence. But no matter how you configure a special tactical unit, the tactics and strategies that they are going to use are ultra-militarized, and they are an occupying force in the community. What really needs to happen is making an investment in the underlying issues. People are struggling with substance use disorder and mental health issues, and there's trauma that people are experiencing, and there's study and research that shows that when you address those issues, disruption and crime in communities go down. It's not policing that really has an impact on crime. Less than 25% of crimes that are reported are solved by the police. Police spend less than 10% of their time actually dealing with crime. And then when you layer on top of that, again, race, regardless of the race of the officers, as the professor pointed out, it gets compounded, and you see acts of violence like this.
Professor, I'm always fascinated when I talk to law enforcement and I talk about traffic stops and talk about dealing with people who are in cars. And they often tell me how dangerous those stops are. And I remember I asked one officer, well, is it dangerous because you think it's dangerous and therefore it makes it more dangerous? Or is it dangerous because of the millions of traffic stops that happen across the country with no incident? You still think that there's something dangerous that's in the car. And obviously, with race putting another layer of bias on how they're going to approach. Are these conversations that we're having right now, do these happen in police departments at all?
Yeah, I'm a member of a group called Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which includes chiefs of police, captains, all the way down to rank and file, officers who are concerned about good policy so that police aren't given bad policy and, unnecessary reservoirs of resentment aren't generated from them having to enforce bad policy. And so absolutely, a lot of times here, what you're talking about is efforts to, kind of solve social problems by putting in police rather than addressing the underlying problems themselves. And when you ask about what are some of the solutions, we're not going to abolish the police. Absolutely, we're not going to abolish the police. We know that, right? But what we can do is unbundle the police. What we can do is take police out of traffic enforcement stops. The chief of police in this particular department said that they couldn't find any traffic infraction that Mr. Nichols was guilty of. Right, so this was really a purely pretextual stop. In studies that we've seen, the traffic fatalities don't necessarily go down when police are taken out of traffic enforcement. So we're not made safer by having police in these stops. What all it seems to do is help provide, fishing expeditions so the police can look for drugs and guns. Well, the war on drugs, folks, we realized that was a failure. I hope we're not continuing to use police for that. And the drugs and the guns, we have 380, 400 million in the country. You get 5 or 10 over a weekend, and you're telling us we made a dent in guns by pulling over all of these folks. So we need to rethink about the footprint of policing itself, and then channel that energy, those police resources to solving crime. that's what people really want, violent crimes to be solved. But when you're chasing turnstile jumpers and, doing quality of life kind of stuff, you're not focusing your resources on the kind of crime solving that people really want their police departments to do.
Rahsaan, you were part of the team that was behind what a difference a DA makes, and certainly your run for district attorney. Is the changes that we are seeing, the quote unquote, and I'm using finger quotes here, progressive DAs across the country, some who are not doing well, but I would offer it's not because of their policies that they're not doing well. Is the progressive DA, is that something that's still taking steam as we move into another election season?
Oh, you hit a sore spot for me, Sue.
I'm sorry. Too soon?
No,
Too
no,
soon?
it's fine. But no, it's not too soon. I think the conversation has shifted and eyes are on district attorneys. People are paying attention to what they're actually doing. I think it is important that the district attorney made swift decision to charge these officers, potentially indict them for very serious crimes. So that's something that has changed, whereas before there was an allegiance and an alignment with law enforcement, and district attorneys' offices would say, well, we need to investigate and get all of the information that we possibly can before making a decision, and whether or not the officer felt that their life was in danger, that there was a threat to the community, informs their decision whether or not to prosecute. This was clearly nothing but unbridled battery and an assault on this individual, and they were punishing him for something that seemed very personal and unrelated to any violation of the law. And so I think it is important that there are so-called progressive district attorneys in positions to make these decisions, and the help of video evidence makes it more so that they'll pursue it.
Professor, just as we finish up here, I was struck also by how many different commands these officers gave that were made compliance impossible by almost anyone. Is this a teachable moment? Also, the idea that by giving commands that someone's already complied with kind of covers the fact that you've got a camera on in case that it's not being seen. Is this sort of evidence to citizens going to help people rise up and say we need reform?
Well, perhaps, but we've seen a lot of stuff like this before. These body cams were on, but if we didn't have that higher up camera, we might not be having this conversation. Also, if Nichols hadn't died, we might not be having this conversation. These kinds of things go on a lot of times without there being these kinds of consequences. It seems that at the end of the day that, all the reforms through a process of elimination, we realize reforms aren't going to really minimize the harm. The harm is going to come from minimizing the contact between our violence workers on the one hand and members of stereotyped groups on the other.
Professor Jody David Armour and Rahsaan Hall, thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen. I appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thank you.